I'm Charles Levitt. I'm Associate Professor of Italian and Associate Director of the Center for Italian Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. And I wanted to welcome you to our final Italian research seminar of the semester, on the final teaching day of the semester. I wanted to present our speakers. So first, thank you for joining us. I hope that you're here not just to listen, but also to participate in the discussion. So we'll have plenty of time for the Q&A after we finish, but at the moment I want to introduce our speaker. Today's lecture is entitled Desire, Anxiety, Shame, Transatlantic Remediations, and Italian Culture. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present Claudia Polezzi, who is the Alphonse M. D'Amato Chair in Italian American and Italian Studies at Stony Brook University. She's written on contemporary Italian travel writing, colonial and post-colonial literature, migrant and diasporic cultures, translingualism and self-translation. She's one of the founding editors of the Transnational Modern Languages book series, published by Liverpool University Press, and she's co-editor of Transnational Italian Studies, 2020, and Transcultural Italy's Mobility, Memory, and Translation, also 2020. Radically and rigorously expanding the field of Italian studies, Professor Polezzi's work has rightly been called groundbreaking, powerful, important, and timely, and I'm so glad you're here with us today. Claudia Polezzi, thank you.
Should go home after that. Okay, so thank you, Charles, and thank you for the invitation. I've been saying it's a real pleasure being here and in this final week, final day of the semester, and to make it to Notre Dame. I've been saying all day that this is one of the mythical places of Italian studies for me. To be honest, the first thing that this was where Buttigieg was translating Gramsci. That was the first thing that it was for me, and then it became. The destination of all my Dantist friends, and I have a few. So this was where they were coming. So thank you again for the invitation. And then an apology, as always. I want to do an awful lot with my 45 minutes, and I may not do everything that I promised in my abstract. I will use mostly Giuseppe Prezzolini, it's here, one of the books, and Kim Ragusa, another of her books, and also a film that I want to show you, with a little bit also of Amerigo Ruggero and of Claudia Durastanti. Now, this is going to be a talk of two halves. The first on the notion of anxiety, and the second on shame and desire, with a brief introduction to situate what I'm going to do, or what I'm trying to do, and a short film in the middle between the two sections. A warning about the film from the beginning. We discussed this with Charles. It's a very powerful piece, and I can say that because I've now shown it to a variety of audiences, including my own students. It's a first-person account of growing up in the America of the 1970s, 1980s. It was shot and released in the 1990s. It's a product of its time, and it is and among other things, you will hear Kim Ragusa, the director and the voice that you hear in the film. You will hear Kim Ragusa, a woman who identifies as African American and Italian American, use the N-word a couple of times. So she's describing her own encounter, her own first-person encounter with racism, and you will hear that word a couple of times there. One very final and much lighter introductory note. Some of my slides, like this one, are illustrated by the works of two artists and friends, B. Amore, that's by B, and Filomena Coppola, two women who identify as part of the Italian diaspora. One is based in the US, B, the other one in Australia, Filomena, and whose works and voices are very much in dialogue with the themes that I'm dealing with here. I will not comment directly on those images, but I'm more than happy to return to them if you want, if you're curious in our discussion. For the moment, in the meantime, they're here to remind us of the intersection of media and locales, but also the intersectionality of gender, ethnicity, class, and much more that needs to guide all cultural analysis. So, end of preliminaries, and now for the actual context and introduction. So my focus here today is on Italian-American culture and on its transnational, indeed, articulation, and on how this can also inform a re-articulation of Italianità, the term is Jennifer Scapetone's, inviting a celebration of its complex roots and of those multiple forms of translation and cultural mediation that Martino Marazzi has recently described as a shuttling principle. Martino's words, a weaving of interrelations between given traditions, a metamorphic paradigm that invests both subjects, authors, and their public, and their products. I will attempt to tackle these themes through some critical reflections clustered around the notion of anxiety, as I said, and then also the twinned notions of desire and shame, as well as shaming. And there are a number of key references behind this framework. Obviously, in a sense, Harold Bloom's classic study, The Anxiety of Influence, from 1973 and then later re-edited in 1997, but also all the way to Sarah Ahmed's theorization of affect in The Cultural Politics of Emotions. But more on this later. For the moment, let me identify the two transatlantic stories of complex linguistic and cultural transfer that I want to take as examples. The first relates to Giuseppe Prezzolini, and in particular his volume of collected essays on Italian Americans, I Trapiantati, which was published by Longanesi in 1963, though the essays themselves are written in a much longer period of time, and collects mostly journalistic writings from 1950s and early 60s. I will read this work in parallel with an earlier one, Amerigo Ruggero's Italiani in America, published by Treves in 1937, in order to highlight some of the continuities in the gaze cast by Italian intellectuals who consciously occupied the role of mediators between Italian and American cultures and decided to write on Italian-American culture, thereby displaying the inherent anxieties of that gaze. And I must add here that I'm indebted for this pairing to the colleagues at Bordighera Press, who recently had both of these volumes translated. The Italians in America came out in 2020, and the Transplants in 2021 as part of their Crossing series. My second example, and I don't have the images here because they'll be out of sequence, but they'll be there later on. My second example will take us, after the film, will take us into the cultural politics of shame and desire through the work, in particular, of Kim Ragusa, whose writing and filmmaking has become increasingly central to me since starting to teach Italian-American studies at Stony Brook with Stony Brook students 3 years ago. Their reactions to Ragusa's work, and even before that, their own experiences and narratives of desire and of multiple versions of shame inform a lot of my thinking about Ragusa and about the work that I want to place next to hers, which is Claudia Durastanti's La Straniera, translated as Strangers I Know, a book that came out in 2019 and then was translated by Elizabeth Harris in 2022. In both cases, I want to ask what kind of mediation these writers are attempting, what images of Italianità they present, and reciprocally, how they view Italian-American identity and culture. And finally, I also want to ask how we can and do reread and indeed translate, mediate and remediate such representations today, and what this says about Italian studies, American studies, Italian-American studies, diasporic, transnational Italian studies, you name it. And a spoiler alert, I'm not a fan of most, perhaps even all of those labels, even though I'm so closely associated now with transnational. And there's a kind of, what I'm not a fan of, I suppose, is that artificial, institutional set of boundaries that they impose as powerful dispositifs or strategies of containment on the movement of culture, of creativity, and ultimately of people. We were talking about this with Ted as we were walking around your beautiful campus. We were talking about it with Sarah, about the fact that it's never just a to B kind of movement. So let me start with my first example, which I call faulty samples with a question mark. So in I Trapiantati, Prezzolini ends his foreword, dated New York, 19th of December 1958, by reproducing a poem taken by a collection by Antonio Barolini, Lamento sul destino degli esuli. You have it there in the English translation, and there's some lines in particular that interest me here. So it goes from land to land, from sea to sea, and at each rip it leaves a piece of its roots and carries away the naked weight of what remains until it dies, shriveled up, never to be reborn, in all places abandoned. It is the destiny of the exile on the sand of the shore. It's a poem about the impossibility of transplantation and about the terrible fate of those who move, of migrants in particular. A side note for those here who may have read Umbertina, Helen Barolini's, that is Antonio Barolini's Italian-American wives, vibrant account of 3 generations of women making and remaking homes across the Atlantic while transplanting rosemary, by the way, rosemary bushes. It is almost impossible, if you've read that, not to think here of the excruciatingly clear-sighted portrait that she gives of Italian poetic circles at the very start of that book, but that would take me in a different direction, so let's leave it at that. But go reread that chapter. It's fantastic to read it against this poem. Now, what interests me here is Prezzolini's choice to preface his own account of Italian-American culture with a title, I trapiantati, and a poem that focus on the notion of roots and deracination, and to frame both metaphors with a heavy biological weight in a markedly negative sense. So for Prezzolini, Italian Americans are, these are his words in the translation, in the English translation that's just been published, and I'm quoting from there. So Italians who migrated to Italian Americans are Italians who migrated to North America, and who, irrespective of their individual success or lack thereof, are mutilated, again, his words, in the language and therefore the spirit. They are, his words again, the product of adaptation and have simultaneously lost touch with the people they originated from without melting with the people who took them in. The result, therefore, is not the fusion of Italian and American qualities. It is instead the confusion of different habits and the smoothing of sharp edges by 2 cultures that are completely stranger to each other. In other words, they are not the sum of 2 wholes, but rather the remainder of 2 subtractions. That's all Prezzolini. Let's be clear, it's not me. And this is Prezzolini again. They're not a mixture of Italy and America. They are Italians lost in America. All the transplants, my definition, says Prezzolini, again, not me, are to a certain degree a little strange, touchy, almost paranoid, and always defensive in front of every criticism. They're also very insecure, as is typical of those who speak a poorly learned language, or use unfamiliar instruments, or walk along an unknown path they have never seen before. That touchiness, according to Prezzolini, also returns in the final piece of the collection, entitled precisely Why Italian Americans Are Touchy, which, together with the preface, frames the collection. So the final and initial piece, I was reading some of the quotations from the preface. These are now from the final piece. So a piece that returns to many of the same themes. The tragedy of migration, the alienated condition it produces, the spiritual alienation embodied in the loss of language, and which is here described as a series of broken words that are often ridiculed by peninsular Italians when they hear them. Again, the Prezzolini's word in the translation. Between this frame, these 2 pieces, the preface and the last one, sit pieces originally written for an Italian audience, mostly for the press, for the daily press, who, Prezzolini says, often asked him, who are these Italian Americans? Why don't they speak Italian like us? Why don't they read the same books we read? Why don't they behave like us? Of himself and of his own perspective, Prezzolini adds that the premise of my writing is that I consider immigration to be a tragedy, and that only someone who has lived in an Italian-American environment without becoming one of them, and without their language and behavior, can be aware of it. These views are not unique to Prezzolini. In fact, that will come later, but never mind, let's move on from Barolini. So these views are not unique to Prezzolini. Published almost 30 years earlier, Amerigo Ruggero's collection of essays, let me go back because it was here, there we go. Amerigo Ruggeri's collection of essays shares many of the same position. positions. Ruggero was a correspondent of La Stampa and also contributed to Il Mattino, Il Messaggero, and other Italian newspapers. And Prezzolini knew his book and, he says, held it in high esteem. Though written at different points in the 20th century, the two volumes share a commonality of gaze and of intention. Both were written by Italians who chose Italian Americans as their subject and took it upon themselves to explain these uprooted and incomplete beings. These expressions are from Ruggero, they could be from Prezzolini's book, for the benefit of their home, that is Italian, readership of the time. Both are also written with an authoritative voice, carrying the weight and often flaunting the expertise of well-known intellectuals who had already established themselves as observers and commentators of American life, not of Italian American, of American life. And links can be drawn here with other such words, of course. There's Borgese's Atlante Americano, there's others. Now, like Prezzolini, Ruggero thought of Italian Americans as tragically uprooted. This is Ruggero. The tragedy of Italian Americans is that of all déracinés, all of those who have been torn from their original stock and transplanted in a new land, in a new environment, among new human groups. Most of all, these volumes express, through Prezzolini's and Ruggero's voices, a series of assumptions and, I would say, also a series of anxieties. Prezzolini's we, like Ruggero's we, is firmly posited on an Italian identity which is assumed as established, homogeneous, uncontroversial, and which is both peninsular, urban, educated, middle class, and largely male. It is on that we, on that assumption, that the gaze and the voice is built, as is the possibility of relating to America, not Italian America, America, on an equal basis, from one nation to another, from one national identity to another, from one national culture and language to another. The anxiety of mediation caused by Italian Americans is precisely that they upset that order, a national order, and that assumption of homogeneity. In discourse which posits culture as nationally constructed, identified, determined, Italian Americans are hard to explain, but also hard to explain away. Why are they not like us, Prezzolini says his readers are asking him. And what will they do to the Americans' perception of what we are, of what Italy and Italian culture are? Will they actually create a negative image, damage or tarnish the brand? That anxiety and the need, therefore, to draw a clear line between Italian American and Italian culture to restore the trust in the product is actually explicitly voiced by Prezzolini. And this is a passage which is quite amazing when you read it, and was written again in the 1950s, early 1960s. Italy sent these people to the United States almost as an afterthought, without thinking that in 50 years they would become the equivalent of commercial samples used by the American ruling class to form judgments on today's Italy. So literally as commercial samples. So how are we to read these anxieties, which I'm calling anxieties of mediation? As I mentioned, one of the intertexts of my talk is Harold Bloom's famous anxiety of influence. Now this is Bloom. Strong poets, there we go. Strong poets make poetic history by misreading one another so as to clear imaginative space for themselves. Weaker talents idealize figures of capable imagination, weaker talents idealize figures of capable imagination appropriate for themselves. But nothing is got for nothing, and self-appropriation involves the immense anxiety of indebtedness. Now, Bloom was talking about poetics. I'm proposing, and instead, to use his concept as a tool to think about the anxiety created by being between and trying to mediate between two cultures. In this sense, I'm closer to what Bob Viscusi describes, to his description of Italian-American writers and more generally Italian-Americans' difficult relationship with Italy and with Italianness, but also with America and Americanness. So Viscusi wrote, in Italian-American writing, Italy is a word that means both the homeland of desire, I'll get to desire in the second part, and the empire that failed. So somehow shame is already, I suppose, in there. Reading Italian-American writing without encountering the hopeless dreams of glory that lie entombed in it is impossible. These dreams, too, are buried Caesars. This is taken from a book which has that title. They shape the tormented mixture of pride and humiliation that gives this literature its texture and appeal. Again, so desire, humiliation, desire, shame at play in here. By the way, there's no colonial disavowal here. Viscusi is talking of fascism's failed attempt to build a colonial empire as much or more than of Rome in this particular passage. So he's well aware of that too. And there would be a lot to say about the colonial perspective and about racialization and racial concern in Ruggeri and in Prezzolini. And Ruggeri's book in particular ends with a letter which is about the attack on Ethiopia, the aggression on Ethiopia, praising it, of course. The question of anxiety works in both directions, though, or perhaps in multiple directions, creating networks of anxiety. If we abandon the image of intercultural relations as vectors, sort of from A to B, and think instead of their more complex trajectories, itineraries, traces, and tracings. Here I have to declare my own situatedness, both as an individual and as a scholar whose own transnational trajectory is not irrelevant to my own gaze. I certainly don't identify with Prezzolini's uncontested we, nor do I expect to live among them, whomever them might be, without becoming one of them. But how do these scholars pose themselves, and how can I position myself? As an Italian born to the illusion of one language, allegedly and falsely without even a dialect, I was born in Tuscany, so I was told that mine was not a dialect, it is, and who spent the majority of her life in the UK and now lives and works in the US, I have a very eccentric position with respect to Italian, American, and for that matter, Italian-American culture. That sideways look is both a privilege and a source of my own anxiety. I have to use it strategically to interrogate my perspective and my own implicatures, to use Michael Rothberg's terms, in histories of inclusion and exclusion. I have to be careful not to look the way that Prezzolini looked, indeed. But I can also use it to create dialogical interrogations, which do not impose my own vision on the stories and the histories I study. And maybe this is also why for the past few years I seem to be writing mostly a quattro mani or even a sei mani. That dialogical and polyphonic impetus is highly congenial and I think is largely a response to the material that I'm dealing with, which does not respond to the centripetal force of the commanding eye and voice of commentators such as Prezzolini, who assume their own interpretative supremacy and also, crucially, an identity of views and unquestionable homogeneity with their intended readership. A well-educated, urban Italian middle class which will share their sense of true Italianità, their values, but also their fears and their anxieties. I have to at least have a sense of awareness as I walk into a classroom as me with that eccentric history trying to explain to a largely, though not entirely, Italian-American self-identifying audience what Italian-Americans are. That would be even worse than Prezzolini, okay? So in Prezzolini and Ruggeri, then, we see the anxiety of an Italy in the shape of its urban intelligentsia, faced with the reality of a diaspora that it would rather forget and in which it definitely does not recognize itself. But there is clearly also an American anxiety here at play. Yeah. There's also an American anxiety at play here, as there is in Harold Bloom's account of poetic history. This is a review from 1973, when it first came out, of Bloom's book, which appeared in the New York Times, and which could be applied equally to the US's ambiguous relationship with Italy, with Europe, and with Italy within that. So Hollander, in reviewing Bloom's book, says, after being debated and mulled over, it may turn out to embody what is after all a theory of American poetry. This is about Bloom's book. The American imagination, in its anxiety about the precursor, Europe, suggests itself as an exemplary image throughout. the problems of what Henry James called the complex fate of having to struggle against a tendency to overvalue Europe, and of Emerson's role as a kind of Milton to his followers, even the strange reversal of American anxiety, which has beset British poets of the past few decades, struggling for independence against what has become the old country of American poetry, all of these can be seen as part of a general history of the imagination rather than a special case. So what here Hollander is reading in Bloom is this reciprocity of anxiety. So there's an anxiety of secondariness that is in American culture with respect to Britain and to Europe more widely, but also on the other hand, there's also this anxiety of being overtaken on the European side. And I think that you can see some of those moves and some of those anxieties again in the kind of mediation that is going on there, or lack of mediation that is going on with Prezzolini and Ruggeri. So how then can Italian-American writers position themselves? What are their own anxieties of mediation between their two cultures as they are constructed according to this model? Viscusi also wrote beautifully about this, describing what he defines as a set of contradictions, and in doing so he also raises the question of languages, and there are at least 3 languages playing a role, I think, here. The most difficult problem for Italian-American readers and writers is language, he says. On the one hand, Italian words establish place and filiation and pride. But on the other hand, the class system of both Italy and the United States tells Italian-Americans that their Italian is only a dialect, a sign of marginality. These are intersectional anxieties. They have to do with class as much as with ethnicity. And as I hinted at earlier, I think we could certainly read them through the lens of gender too. And yet these anxieties are also deeply anchored to a monological and monolingual normative view of identity, and on a binary, dichotomic, and vectorially oriented, so A to B, we're going from here to there. Migration is that thing that takes us from one place to another. So that model of translation and of migration and of cultural mediation. That is where we can find our tasks, I think, as mediators, in breaking the mold of identity, which using ethnicity strategically is fine when needed, but breaking that mold of identity, on the other hand, and abandoning restrictive, exclusionary, national and linguistic models, what has been described as the methodological nationalism that still informs much scholarship, especially in modern languages. Thinking of translation, linguistic, cultural, Ina, where are you? Yes, so linguistic, cultural translation, but thinking of translation and of mediation at all levels, not as transfer, not as a vector or a bridge between autonomous and self-contained spaces, territories, language, canons, as if they were islands, but rather as a kind of ping-pong ball, the shuttling that Martino Merazzi is talking about, which releases energy and gets charged up again, bounces forward or even back, but never hits exactly the same spot. Or if you want another metaphor, one I didn't invite, there are references here to Bakhtin, to Yildiz, and to others. Well, I offer you this one, courtesy of Italo Calvino, the intricate weaving of an oriental rug, the weft and the warp of our daily lives and how culture moves through those. But let me move to my next example, and I'll just introduce it and then show you the short film that I spoke about, and then we'll take it from there. So let me try a different tack. Let me move from the anxiety produced by political, methodological nationalism, and that nationalism in Prezzolini's gaze in particular, with its rigid notions of identity and its antagonistic forms of memory and belonging, to more fluid, but not necessarily happier or less traumatic, forms of narrativization of diasporic selves. And let me also move to this coupling of shame and desire. My key theoretical reference here is Sarah Ahmed, who has written extensively about affect, tracing a long history of thought that sees passions and emotions as inferior to reason, and highlighting also at the same time how feminism as well as post-colonial and decolonial theory challenge that view. Her work also stresses that there is an established hierarchy of emotions. Some are perceived as elevated and a sign of cultivation. Others are meant to be lower and to represent markers of weakness, ignorance. All are powerful, though, so much so that we must learn to control them, especially the low ones. That control, or lack of it, is not just personal. It's not a personal quality. It is an acquired cultural trait. There exists a social politics of emotion, Ahmed says, and within it, the work performed by emotions is relational. They orient us and reorient us towards others. But what if others, instead of being what we saw in Prezzolini, some object you look at from afar or from close enough but without ever becoming one of them, what if others and diversity of languages, of pacts, of belonging, are not foreign, are not the stranger who comes knocking at our door, as in Derrida's by now classic discussion of hospitality, but are instead always already here. And here to stay, part of us, part of a plural mode of belonging, part of our desires, part of what we already and always conditionally love, and yet also always already inscribed with those parts of us that we are ashamed of, or the ones for which we carry shame, those that have shamed us or for which we have been shamed. So let me show you a short movie, which is the closest I've got so far to finding something that visualizes what I'm thinking. And this is Kim Ragusa's autobiographical Fuori, Outside, which dates from 1997. And as I said, there's a warning about the topic and the use of language. It's here. Okay, now we got it. Okay, fine.
Do you remember that day when the neighbors were moving out? We were standing together on the front porch. You were so nervous, you kept wringing your hands and looking up and down the block, waiting to see who would move in. You looked up at me and said, "I hope they're white." I was furious, but I never challenged you. For me, it was just another example of the racism of your people. But your people are also my people. This is a letter to you, to try to talk to you in a way that hasn't been possible before, to cross the lines of time, memory, and color that map our relationship and complicate our ability to communicate.
Yeah. You ain't gonna ask my mother's house, didn't you? No, no.
I think so when I was little. When I was little.
Yeah.
She came here too, remember?
When you have meat in the sauce, usually. 117.
Yeah. 113th or 116th?
113.
Yeah.
She moved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was there, and I was remember when we moved, she came here.
I think you took pictures too.
When I was then?
You took pictures of her?
No, I was small.
I like to see, yeah.
I was
I like to see her pictures.
Yeah?
It's been 22 years since we moved into this house. You and Grandpa, and Evelyn and Donna, Dad, Mercedes, and me. Everyone saved up and went in together. You told me later that it was Grandpa's idea to leave the Bronx, that he wanted to move to the country so he could have a garden and we could all be safe, away from the crime of the city. But this is not exactly the country. It's a suburb of Newark. And for us, the move was not that seamless. Everyone worked 2 and 3 jobs just to keep up payments on the house. Dad and Mercedes split up. Grandpa got sick and died. Then Aunt Evelyn. You lost your hearing, your memory, your lucidity. What's left is this house. It's funny, but after all this time, I still think of the Bronx as home. It's the most familiar place to me, where I felt the most myself. I felt safe there, ran wild, played in the streets with my friends. It's also where I first learned about racism. I was out with a bunch of the other kids. One boy pointed at me and said to Donna, "I think there's a nigger here." She said, "No, that's my cousin Kim. It's just dark outside." I didn't know what the word nigger meant, but I knew it separated me from everybody else. When I was born, my father didn't tell you, because you didn't approve of his relationship with my African-American mother. After a few years, when he started seeing Mercedes, he told you that I was her niece. I guess it seemed more acceptable that I was a Puerto Rican stranger than your half-black grandchild. It took you longer than anyone else in the family to get used to the idea, to accept me as blood of your blood. These things never got talked about. Your anger at him, your ambivalence toward me, the masquerade around my origins. I was just light enough to pass on those streets in the Bronx, just light enough to make it into the family. What if I hadn't been?
This in church? It's 115th Street, Mount Carmel. Look. Oh, look. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
With the feast? When you're going to see the Madonna's going to come out?
Nice. It's when they're coming out.
Yeah.
I'm in the crowd. I don't think you could see me.
Yeah.
In the crowd.
But these aren't our only secrets. What do I really know about you? Only the barest facts of your life. Your parents came from Calabria and you were born here. You grew up in East Harlem. Your mother, Louisa, was a healer who kept magic herbs in paper bags in the closet. And your father shines shoes. You did piecework as a child and young adult, and at 16 you were forced out of school and into an arranged marriage to a man from the village back home. Later, you worked as a maid in a Gramercy Park hotel.
Your mom was beautiful.
Yeah, she was. Everybody admired her. She was treated alike by everybody. All her neighbors, you know, her friends. They still talk about her.
She made the cookies, right? Remember you told me that in the house?
Oh, him. He stinks.
Who? He?
My father. He stinks. He thinks who he was. Now he treated my mother. And I was only a little girl. How many things she got from me?
I didn't know about this. This is all new.
Now, how many times I said, you ought to drop that, you ought to drop that.
You grew up in a time when it was a man's right to beat his wife. You grew up in a time when Southern Italian immigrants were lynched along with African Americans. All your life you dreamt of a place where you could be safe. Like so many others, you thought you could protect yourself by creating borders around your body, your family, your neighborhood. For you, moving away from the city was about escaping danger. In the vast whiteness of the suburban middle class, our house was supposed to be a fortress, a place to live happily ever after. This was the American dream. It was another kind of migration, and so much was lost along the way. I began to understand that when Yusef Hawkins was murdered in Bensonhurst. Great-grandma eventually threw her husband out. She forbade anyone in the family to ever speak to him again. And the new neighbors were African American. You grew to trust them and count them among your few friends in the neighborhood. When they moved, you were twice as worried as before. And from either side of the margins, you and I have found a place to come together. There's so much of this story that's not written in stone.
Okay, so here, as in the twin short film Passing, devoted to her African-American grandmother, Miriam, Ragusa is telling a story which is about race, ethnicity, gender, and about growing up with a constant reminder, literally written on the body, of her difference, her own unbelonging. The film is an open letter to Gilda, her Italian-American grandmother, and it is shocking in its brutality as much as its gentleness, its candor of denunciation, and its generosity of gesture and gaze. I use it to tell my students, who often start mid-semester to say that they want to go and interview the grandparents, they want to talk to their family, and so on. I use it to tell them that when you go into those houses, those rooms, those stories, often untold, you have to be unflinching as much as you have to be gentle and you have to be generous. Shame and desire are entwined from the start in Ragusa's film and also in her memoir, The Skin Between Us, which covers a lot of the same ground and much more. What shames us, who shames us, how we shame ourselves, how we try not to be shamed again by others. Shame is always, I think, the most intimate and yet also the most public of emotions. The book opens with a photograph. We've seen some of those photographs there, but the book opens with this photograph. It opens with a photograph showing Kim and her two grandmothers together. It's the only one in which they are ever take a picture together. It also talks about other photos. You've seen some of them in the film. A few, the only ones saved, salvaged from the dramas of family history and the stories they reticently tell. There is anxiety reproduced in gesture. These are words from the book. My dark cross-screw hair pulled back, something I had learned to do whenever I went to some place where I didn't want to stand out, which for most of my life has been most of the time. And also reproduced in nightmares. This memory or dream or image has stayed with me all these years, as clear as if it had happened yesterday. It tells me something about my anxiety of belonging. Did it really happen? I guess I'll never know the truth. There is also desire in the film. The desire to belong, to claim her own sense of being Italian. Here is Kim traveling to Rome, Florence, Milan at 13 with her African-American mother and grandmother. It was my first visit to Italy, so different from the Italian-American world I knew back home. But it was my mother's gift to me, a new connection to the country of my paternal ancestors. And with this gift, my increased desire or need to claim my Italianità. And there is shame, plenty of it. The imposed shaming, vergogna, of an interracial relationship and its fruit. The internalized shame of not being enough, of not having acquired enough culture, language, tradition, family recipes. Here are just a couple of quotations. Safety in my father's world was always provisional. I didn't notice the suspicious, disapproving looks being cast our way, a woman's voice muttering, vergogna. I don't know the words, another quotation, of any of the songs. You heard some of those songs here in the film, in any language, and I walk with a sense of shame that I can't add my voice to those of the women around me. I feel as though I've lost something I never knew I had, something whose presence I can only sense in its absence. This is something that my students report a lot. They talk about the shame of not knowing, the shame of not having enough of that culture, of feeling somehow to not have done their duty to it. Shame and desire are powerful tools. Ragusa's storytelling punctures, deflates, and ultimately destroys the narrative of victimization that has long been a central part of the Italian-American mythology, just as it destroys the myth of the old country and the attendant myth of genealogy, of family heritage, of the heroic grandparents and great-grandparents who crossed the Atlantic. And yet, this is also a story of gifts, crisscrossing cultures, languages, histories, voluntary or involuntary gifts that disavow the binarism of identity, the ownership of memory and tradition, to reinscribe each story with a different perspective. As we've seen, Kim's African-American mother taking her to Italy for the first time, but also her Italian-American father and his Puerto Rican girlfriend buying her a set of drums and passing on the love of jazz, or her African-American grandmother instilling into her a sense of her Italian heritage and introducing her to the myth of Persephone and Demeter. So these are all things she punctures. So the myth of Persephone and Demeter, a new, old myth, new for her, old in itself, that opens and closes the book. At the start, we see Ragusa on a ferry between Calabria and Sicily, traveling to the island of her ancestors precisely to make a film on Persephone's myth, seeing her family's history in the waters of the Mediterranean, migration, slavery, the moving between close and distant shores, Calabria and Sicily, Sicily and the United States. Deciding, however, that it is Harlem she is longing for in reality. At the end, she embraces the inexcusable and unerasable violence of her own and her family's history. We heard a lot about that violence in the film. Persephone, she says, is transformed from captive girl to queen of the underworld when she eats pomegranate seeds. In most versions of the myth, Hades forces her to eat the seeds, and Persephone recounts this violation helplessly and tearfully to Demeter. But in Ovid's Metamorphosis, Persephone eats the fruit herself, stealing a pomegranate from a tree in Hades' vast, lush garden. She breaks open the rough red skin of the fruit and puts the 7 seeds into her mouth. I like this image of Persephone better, choosing her own fate. These are the last words in the book. So a coda, as I promised, on Claudia Durastanti's autobiographical novel. That's her definition, not mine, La Straniera. And a brief return to anxiety, which here becomes anxiety of dissolution. In Durastanti's tale, in Durastanti's tale, diversity, difference, the shuttling between are much more than binary. As she and the members of her family move between history and fantasy, between multiple locations, Brooklyn, the rural south of Italy, Rome, London, and much more, between multiple languages, she's a coda, by the way, and she grew up with dialect, Brooklyn, Italian, English, and other languages. Between alternative family mythologies, the book opens with two very different versions her parents give of how they met, for instance. Later on, we find her discussing the question of truth, which is here. Mia madre non sopporta la finzione. Quando guardiamo qualcosa sullo schermo arriva sempre il momento in cui mi chiede: ma è una storia vera? Anche se stiamo guardando un film dell'orrore. E io devo mentirle, perché se le dico che è tutto inventato, li perde interesse e non riusciamo più a fare una cosa insieme. Il suo "ma è una storia vera" mi tormenta da sempre. In her narrative, languages mix and translation becomes an existential condition, one which threatens our sense of self in ways that feel and are literally inscribed on the body. Io di errori nella traduzione ne facevo sempre, continuo a farli, perché nessun significato assume una forma stabile in me e tutto quello che penso, quello che poi dico, soffre nella trasmigrazione tra paesi diversi, sanguinando, proprio come gli astronauti che hanno trascorso troppo tempo nello spazio e quando tornano a casa hanno epistasi continue sotto il sole. Yet this return of anxiety, this anxiety of dissolution, of losing oneself, losing one's blood, literally, the sense of alterity, difference, translation, mediation, shuttling as mutilation, that's a word that she uses, but was also Prezzolini's word, if you remember from one of the early quotations I gave you. So that sense is revealed for what it is, a repeatedly self-inflicted wound. And I can't stop thinking, by the way, that Claudia was writing this in post-Brexit Britain, by the way. Straniero è una parola bellissima se nessuno ti costringe ad esserlo. Il resto del tempo è solo una mutilazione e un colpo di pistola che ci siamo sparati da soli. As with Ragusa's Persephone, so with Durastanti's self-fictionalizing translators, we enter the garden, we steal the fruit, we eat the seeds, and we choose our own fate. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me open the floor for questions and discussion.
Yes.
Thank you. That was a fantastic presentation. Unfortunately, I haven't read The Skin-Betweens, but I will now. I've been meaning to for a long time. But I was thinking about the grandmother's reaction to the news of the neighbours.
Yes.
And I was thinking about it in terms of the racialization and then the de-racialization of Italians in the US, and how that might map onto ideas of shame and anxiety around race, and how that plays a role in that response. And I also wondered about the inverse operation, about...
So the inverse.
Yes,
Yeah.
when Kim Ragusa has her experience of going to Italy, not having the context of the book, I don't know if she writes about this, but I feel that Italy is a nation that doesn't have its own tools to talk about race, and that this is perhaps becoming more prevalent. And there's often the reference to that US writers and intellectuals, particularly about race. So I wondered if you could talk about that.
Okay, let me start from the second and then return to the first. So in terms of Ragusa's discussion of Italy and of going to Italy, it's really interesting. The film obviously is not about that. The book does have moments when we're in Italy, essentially at the beginning and at the end, but also and that's a framing, as I said. It's really interesting. So it's framed by being on this ferry. It's almost, reminds me of Viaggio in Sicilia, Vittorini. There's this framing, this kind of getting to the island. She's not actually on the island, but she's thinking about it. But that framing is really to tell us that what she wants to really talk about is Harlem. What she wants to talk about is the Bronx. What she wants to talk about is the experience of America. At the same time, when she's in Italy, so Italy is a gift from her mother, not from her father. It's her mother, according to the narrative that we have in the book, who is African-American with a lot of, again, the background is very complicated, genealogy is very complicated, but her mother ends up being a model, and she works largely in Milan and lives in Milan and Rome for a number of years with her Italian boyfriend, who's not her father by then. But those two worlds, Italy and Italian America, are very separate for Kim Ragusa. And Italy is the gift of her mother, not the gift of her father. The Italy that she remembers and she has heard about, the Italy of the myths and of the tales that come from the paternal side, is very, very different from the modernity of Italy that she encounters when she gets there. So there is that difference. She doesn't really talk about her own positioning or her mother's racial positioning in that world, other than we know her mother is a model, we know she moves in certain circles, she even says that she has some small roles in Italian cinema of those years. I don't know, I haven't done that research, and in a sense, again, how much of this is true in a literal sense and much of this is narratively true, I wouldn't want to judge. But we don't hear about the racialization of the black body in Italy in that. Except that she says on that ferry she has her hair held up in order to pass effectively. And the other film, even shorter than this, that she devotes to her African-American grandmother is called Passing, and it's about whether you pass or don't pass. And in this film too, I mean, the silences in this film are, whoa. After that question, after that, I guess it was easier to believe that I was a Puerto Rican stranger then. And we had that, I don't know, it's seconds and seconds. It feels like forever of silence, that question left there hanging in the air. So the question of, I could pass, I was light enough, but what if I wasn't? And that question hanging there, what if I wasn't? So the sense or the sensation seems to be that maybe, but then she was traveling in Italy with her mother and her grandmother, who were much more visibly in terms of the skin between us, in terms of that writing on the body. She doesn't speak about that. She doesn't tell us about that. The racialization of Italian Americans is what this is all about, absolutely. And it's that tale of a proximity and the need for the distance. And so that's why that combination of desire and shame, she literally says in another passage, I am the product of that proximity and that desire. But at the same time, the product of that proximity and that desire is what causes the vergogna, okay? Is that sense of shaming. But then what she, on the other hand, also carries is the sense of, but my real shame is not being who I am. How could I be ashamed of that? I'm shamed for it, but I'm not ashamed of that. But her sense of shame is, I am not Italian enough, or I don't know enough. I haven't learned the language. I cannot. She goes to Mount Carmel. She joins one of those processions, and she says, but I can't sing. I cannot sing the songs in any language, in Sicilian, in Italian, in English. I do not know them. And that is an interesting sense of shame, but a shame that spurs into action, which is really interesting, I think. And that I do see a lot in my students, especially, I have to say, the women. Especially the women, that sense of, I want to honor that tradition, but without being stuck in it. And yes, the rationalization of the Italian bodies. I mean, I teach that, and there's documents out there which are amazing, where literally, this propaganda material from the state of Massachusetts, I think, from 1906, around that time. There's this video which is about promoting English, and it's Pete, the Italian migrant, arriving, and it's literally, you'll be lower then unless you learn English, and that specter of you will be lower than the black body, you will be lower than the black worker is definitely what is going on here. But it's that that's why I want to read it through that combination of desire and shaming. And then beyond that, there is this anxiety that affects that relationship between Italian America, Italy, America, that multiple anxiety. Yeah.
Thank you. That was an amazing talk. And I wanted to say how many resonances it had, I think, for the Irish-American experience, for the racialization, for those signs that said no dogs, no blacks, no Irish.
No Irish, yeah.
And I just wanted to make there are more comments than questions. First of all, I wanted to draw your attention to Cullen Pilbeam's novel, Brooklyn.
Sorry, yeah, what's the title?
So it's called Brooklyn.
Oh, yes, Brooklyn, the one from which the film was made.
Yeah.
Yes.
Where an Irish girl migrates to New York, goes back to Ireland, finds a potential suitor but has actually married her Italian boyfriend and chooses to go back at the end. And apparently Cullen Pilbeam has written a sequel which will be out soon, which I'm sure, it's that next.
That I didn't know.
Really
Yeah.
And the other thing was, yesterday I did a podcast with a Puerto Rican American poet called Martín Espada. And Martín Espada has a poem where he's talking to his classmate, he's 8, in school in America. And she's the only one who speaks to him. At one point, her friend leans over and says something. And she turns to him and says, "Are you a spiv?" And he says, "Yes, I am."
Yeah.
And he says that word meant the end of, I suppose, innocence.
Yes.
And I thought it was interesting that it was more acceptable to be Puerto Rican.
Yes.
Than African American.
Than African American. Well, it was more acceptable to her grandmother, although again in the book it comes up in more ways. And so again, I'll start from here and then I'll return to the Irish American question. But we also have moments when in the book Kim Ragusa is saying, what a paradox, you left the Bronx in order to, because it was being invaded by the Puerto Ricans, not in order, because it was no longer our place, so that's why the grandfather decided to go. That's why you were looking for, the white picket fence, the very white suburbs. It's a place in New Jersey that they moved to, and then you had a Puerto Rican in your house because her father then, for a number of years has a Puerto Rican live-in girlfriend, and so the grandparents live downstairs, they live upstairs, so you left because of the Puerto Ricans and you have one living in your house. So clearly it wasn't totally fine. But it was fine that she was not blood of our blood, instead of a question of blood. And there's also a phenomenal scene in the book where the great-grandmother gets introduced to Kim as a child. And a question to her father is this really blood of your blood? And he says, yes. He says, fine. That's it. That closes the argument. So it's really interesting how these things are described there. But the Irish, so a lot of my students are also Irish American in those classes. They come and take these courses on Italian American, and some of them are Irish Italian American. And I've had some of them come up to me and say, can you explain to me why is it, my mom who is Italian, and she says she's always been treated so badly in my dad's Irish family. They look down on her. And again, that question of proximity, and in the case of Irish and Italian, of course, the question of the common Catholicism, but two different brands of Catholicism, all of those stories, and there's plenty of work. Stefano Lucconi, for instance, has worked a lot on the Irish and Italian parishes, especially in the Boston area, and how they were worshipping in different spaces often, and so on. So there is that question again of what unites and what separates, and I suppose we all know this. I think about it in terms of language. The closer you are, the more you see the differences in a way. So it's like, where I grew up, I can hear the difference in the accent from one village to the other. If you move me further away, my ability is much less. So that ability to see the differences. But so much of that history is shared, And it was part of that being white, but Catholic white, white on arrival, but endangered whiteness. It's that threatening of whiteness that in a society which is deeply racist, which
not white enough.
White but not white enough, which is what in the case of Kim Ragusa is constantly is sort of redoubled by the fact that she is this mixed person. She is in between, and so that sense of belonging that is always thrown at her. But also that you can't be both. You have to be this or you have to be that. It's sort of somewhere, but yes, it's all about endangered whiteness and what that sense of endangered whiteness then produces. But that's why that film, this narrative to me is so interesting, because it punctures that. It punctures that narrative that says, that is purely about victimization. Yes, there's victimization, but the victimization then turns into a discourse which is itself at times racist. But I think Kim Ragusa's writing is so measured in trying to understand.
And is the film available?
It's very complicated to get it. You can get it on DVD. I then transposed it. You can get it. And the other one, Passing, is 6 or 7 minutes long. And it's about, again, the story is also in the book, and it's about her African-American. Again, African-American is a shorthand. There's more complicated stuff in terms of the whole sort of genealogy. But it's about her other grandmother traveling along the East Coast from New York down to South Carolina and passing and risking not passing, and it's so again that theme comes up again. Both of them are complicated to get, but you can get them on DVD.
We have both DVDs in the Hesburgh Library.
Yes.
So right around the corner.
One result of my coming here is that you got the DVDs there, and one result of Charles's good offices. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question coming out of the word used by Prezzolini,
the Prezzolini
translation that you mentioned, where he was talking about Italian Americans being characterized by a certain touchiness. And I was curious about both what the translation of that from Italian was, because to me touchy has two different senses of both. Like if something's a touchy subject, it's when you can't talk about, but someone can also be a touchy person who's like always putting their hands.
No. It's touchy as in it's permaloso. Okay. It's permaloso. So it's they take things that they're immediately. They immediately resent whatever you say. It's permaloso. It's touchy as in very. But honestly, if you read the tone of the stuff, wouldn't you be permaloso? I think I would be quite touchy if. But it's this imposition of that gaze. And when I got to the point where it literally says, well, we sent them faulty samples, basically, and then we didn't think that 50 years later, this is the material by which America is judging Italy. Hey, it was literally so. And it's purely commercial. It really is at the level of this is international relations, it's diplomacy, it's marketing, it's whatever it is, and we send them this bunch, and then it's. But there is this sense that and I'm using Prezzolini here. Prezzolini, this is a book from 1960s. It's not the 19th century. We were talking about Oietti earlier. Ruggero is earlier, is during fascism, but you still hear some of those questions or some of those, this Italian Americans. I've used in some other pieces. I've used the scene from Toto Truffa's 62, 63. I can't remember. You must have. Some of you must have seen it. It's this famous comedy sketch movie from the 1960s. In one of the sketches, Toto is a con man who's attempting to sell the Trevi fountain to an American. Now that's how I remembered it. When I went to see it again, it's not to an American. It's to an oriundo, it's to an Italian American who made money and who now wants to come back. And the one who's made the butt of the joke is the Italian American. It's not the American tourist, it's the Italian American. It's there, it's there. And so, would you be touchy? I don't know. But, yeah.
Thank you very much for that very stimulating talk. This might be a little bit off coming. I wonder if you could say something about the state of American studies in Italy. I'm thinking about the connection between certain travel writers and the Centro di Studi Americani in Rome.
Right.
I think that's founded in the 1930s. People like Mario Soldati, Americo
Right,
Primo
right.
Amore,
Yes, yeah.
Emilio Cecchi. So
Yep.
there's a generation of Italians who get interested in the United States and write about it, and they establish, that center. What role might that play in this? The field of Italian American studies is probably 30 years old.
Okay, right. So the history of the center, I don't know enough about it, so it wouldn't be up. I wonder, Sarah, have you come across any of the history of that? You might know more than I do on that, actually. But certainly those writers, yes, so Prezzolini lived here for a long time as well in the United States, but Cecchi spent a long time. But you have, all of them, Calvino is here, and they were also writing, Cecchi writes America Mara, but also writes on Parise, writes a wonderful book on America. But they're looking at America. They're not necessarily looking, there may be occasionally some bits of it which are devoted to some pages, a sketch, whatever it is, devoted to Italian Americans. But the interesting thing about Prezzolini and Ruggero is that these are books that are specifically looking at Italian Americans. Written for, as much travel writing is written, one of the things about travel writing is the eye of the traveler and the voice and the traveler and perspective of the traveler is meant to be coinciding or close to the people he or she, in this case, they're mostly men, they're writing for. So it's written for that perspective rather than from here. And most of them don't write in that way. So there's another part of this talk where I take the example of Pietro Di Donato, the Italian-American writer, one of the founding fathers, according to, again, the way that the narrative has been constructed, to say, since the 1980s, 1990s, when Italian-American studies has become more of an academic subject. And Di Donato is really interesting because he writes as an Italian-American, and he writes as an American of the working class, the bricklayer, writer, etc. I was saying I go to class with one of the bricks which he late and scored, and take the brick to class. But at the same time, he later on tried to take on that role of mediator. And it's a role that largely fails precisely because, this question of who are you writing for, who, and what perspective are you taking? It's really, really interesting case. I can't go into that now, but I'm writing on that as well. The state of American studies in Italy is yet another topic, and there the thing is that American studies in Italy is not Italian-American studies. Now, you have phenomenal figures. Duranti, everybody misses him, just like we miss Bob Viscusi. There are these amazing figures who have facilitated and who have done a lot to create an understanding of Italian-American literature, of Italian-American culture. But American studies in Italy it's Anglo-Americana. Yeah. So it's a different story.
Yeah.
Ted.
Thank you. Very, as always, very rich, your writing, your work. I hope it's a constructive criticism, but I really was not convinced by the transition. It seemed like you skipped a generation. And I think that from a historical, cultural point of view, I'm very taken by all the tropism of anxiety and shame and so on. But I feel like you missed the crucial generation, which is, you're talking about the grandchildren of the immigrants. The immigrants were in their maturity in Prezzolini's time, so I felt like there was a little bit of slippage there, and I don't know if that was purposefully.
You're an old hand. I did. No, I skipped.
And okay, so
you got me. I skipped. Well, I skipped. There's a whole part of this which is on Di Donato and what happens to Di Donato between the 30s and the 60s.
Too, though. I mean, I'm just questioning. Yeah. I don't see the anxiety vis-a-vis the home country.
Don't you?
The Italian Americans of the generation of my grandfather. So he had no use for Italy. He was not interested in Italy. He had no anxiety vis-a-vis Italy. They wanted to forget Italy. They couldn't care less about Italy. St. Patrick's.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
now they had a different kind of, I mean, it was much more directed towards assimilation
Yes.
in the American culture. I can see that, although even there, anxiety, I don't see the anxiety of influence in that particularly, I think, and anxiety might not be the right word. An agonistic, aggressive, lots of other emotions I can see in that generation.
Yeah.
And then, now it's fairly typical for grandchildren of immigrants of my generation to then go and, by very strange means, rediscover Italy. When I was in college studying Italian, my grandfather said to me, I went to him with my Dante book, and I said, see, I'm reading Dante. And he said, you're trying to learn everything that I want to forget. Yeah. So that kind of burst my balloon. But so I feel like it's important. I don't want to give you a hard time, but I feel like it's important, the historicization of the generational development, because I think all this identity stuff that we're immersed in is also a product of our generation. So it's characteristic of sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's particularly pronounced now.
Yeah.
I hope it's a fair.
No, it's really completely. It's a perfectly fair comment, but it's also a shrewd comment because yes, the central part, which is not in this presentation, is about Di Donato, but not so much the Di Donato of 1939, 1940, but what happens later on, and the way that he really tries to mediate Italy for that generation, and it doesn't work. Because they don't care, but also because what he's giving them is not what they want. Because I think that the anxiety that is there, I would insist that I think there is an anxiety there, and the anxiety that is there is, it's an anxiety about not being the right Italians again. And so there is a form of denial, I think, there, and there is a form of because they are being told by Italians like Prezzolini. I mean, those people.
You see that in Christ in Concrete?
No, not in Christ in Concrete.
Okay.
No, not in Christ in Concrete. It's later on. It's when he starts writing, on the one hand, on Mother Cabrini, but on the other hand, he starts writing on the big events that are happening in Italy. From the killing of, what's the name? The young girl who was made a saint after being raped. Santa Maria Goretti. Yeah. From the killer of Santa Maria Goretti to what happened with Aldo Moro.
Yeah.
And he literally shapes himself up, or tries to shape himself up, into that kind of mediator. And when you look at his diaries, at his letters, at his stuff, as I'm doing at present, it's all about, I need to go and I spent it. Not that we wouldn't, I would have written, I spent an evening with Fellini or with Giulietta Masina, but it's that kind of, that sort of sense of secondariness. And Viscusi does write about that very, very beautifully. So what is missing, you're absolutely right, but what is missing is that chapter of this, which is there. And I think, for me, it's interesting that there is this kind of reciprocity, but there's also, in that sense, it's not necessarily. Again, I think what I was trying to say with that quotation from the review of Harold Bloom's book is that it's not just an Italian-American anxiety, it's an American anxiety about that kind of, what's our relationship with Europe? America is the leading culture, is the global culture, is Hollywood, whatever else, but then at the same time there's this stratum, the substratum somewhere that says, oh yeah, but kind of they were there first, okay, or Shakespeare, Dante, whatever. So it's interesting, that reciprocity of anxieties, but you're absolutely correct, there's a whole chunk missing, and it's not the Di Donato Christ in Concrete, but the Di Donato that comes afterwards. But spot on.
Just a footnote, it's also a generational thing.
Yeah.
And outside of ethnic literature, Nelson Algren is another example of someone who fails, it sounds like Di Donato, to be received. Nelson Algren, the author of Man with a Golden Arm.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
his class.
Yeah.
But he's kind of like Di Donato, you know, like a one-shot wonder.
Yeah, yeah.
And but it becomes very prominent among European because he had a relationship with Simone de Beauvoir and so
Yeah.
on. And there is this attempt of a certain American author, kind of fringe author, in that I'm talking about the 50s and 60s, later 60s, that the Europeans are looking for American
Yes, and
authenticity or whatever it was they were looking for, and it doesn't. I think Calgren might be interesting to look at.
To look at.
It sounds similar to.
Yeah, and as I was saying, in here, then there's a whole. What is also inscribed in here is the question of class, of course. And so, you know, with someone like Di Donato, that's the other insurmountable obstacle in so many ways. And that's the other thing that's so blatantly there and so interestingly there. But there is, and the same goes with, you know, what we're seeing here with Kim Ragusa. It's not just, there's also the question of class. And that idea of, yes, there's the question of whiteness, and there's also the question of whiteness and social class are intertwined again. And so the desire and the shame mix up all of that too. So it's not just, there's always also the question of class and then in many cases the question of gender, so the gendered relationship, the kind of violence that is inscribed in these family histories and all of that is part of that, that thing. But you're absolutely spot on. In the middle, between these two, there's a whole chunk which is about that and which is about Di Donato. Yep.
Very dumb question. I mean, I should ask her because we live like 100 meters from each other. Claudia, does she identify as Italian American?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think so. Again, when I've spoken to Claudia, no, I don't think so.
Yeah, because like she translated a lot of Irish people, by the way.
Yeah. No, I mean, Claudia, again, I know Claudia, yes, and apologies. So with Kim Ragusa, I occasionally say Kim in the sense that that's how she describes herself in the book. With Claudia, I know her, so it comes out as Claudia. But no, I don't think so. But at the same time, she, you know, what does she identify as? You know, and it's really interesting that passage, that passage about stranger, etc. It's in the middle of a passage that talks about her failed relationship with London, the fact that she never managed to find a place in London. She found herself in London at the worst of possible times, and it really hit her in so many ways.
She identifies as Southern.
She does, yes, if anything, yes, but at the same time she doesn't identify entirely with that rural setting in Basilicata, or, you know, she doesn't identify with that either. And that's what makes these books so interesting. I couldn't speak at length of La Straniera, but it's an amazing book. It's a phenomenal book, and the translation into English is also a very good translation. It's an incredible book. It's one of the best books I've read for the last few years, definitely. And it's so meandering because precisely, you know, but also it starts with those two narratives. This is what my mother says about how they met. This is what my father says about how they met. The only thing they agree on is that they met in Rome, and one saved the other's life. Okay, but, you know, and so there's always another angle and another way. And with her, it's also the language. There's so much work in that book about language, as there is in Kim Ragusa's book. There's so much work about language. In what language, what inflected language, what accented language. And it's beautiful. But no, I don't think she identifies. But she sort of almost identifies as a Brooklynite. You know, Brooklyn is what she remembers, but again, a Brooklyn that doesn't exist any longer, because also there's a question of, there's time, there's always time in this. So the Harlem or the Bronx or the whatever that Ragusa's mother or grandmother relate to is always already not there. And I think with Claudia, I should ask her. But,
yeah, I see her every week.
Yeah, well, say hi to her. I'll see her in Sorrento, if not before. But no, it's I think Brooklyn probably yes, but would she identify as Italian American? No, I don't think so. Yeah. And I ask my students, you know, under what conditions would I ever become an Italian American? It's an interesting question to ask. But
I was tempted to save my question for dinner, and I'm standing between everybody in our break, but as you mentioned both time and class, I felt like I had to ask the question that's kind of burning. So, but first, a question to build off of Ted's Nelson Algren reference, which I think seems quite promising. I wanted to ask about John Fante, because he seemed like the one author, if I'm not mistaken, that generation of the Americanisti, Pavese, and Michelini, that they picked up on him. Yeah.
Yes, him and Christ in Concrete, the one-off wonders,
but,
yes.
But I felt like it was more fun to...
Much more.
Christ in Concrete, if I'm not mistaken, there was talk of making a neorealist film about, or film of that period, but John Fante seemed like the writers were interested.
Yes, No, and Fante has a long history in Italy, a history of editions, re-editions, translations, and retranslations, and yes, I also teach Fante. In fact, I was telling Ted earlier on when we went for a walk around your beautiful campus that I had the first time that I taught Fante here, and I taught Fante at Stony Brook, and I assigned, and it was in the middle of COVID, everything online, I didn't even meet my students, but these classes are very much mixed, with people identifying as everything and anything, which is wonderful. And I assigned 2 short stories, one of which was, one I can't remember what it was, but the other one I know, it was Odyssey of a Wop. By the way, spiffs, wops, I also have to give warnings, and then we start analyzing all these horrible kind of labels, all these derogatory terms, and the things that come out are incredible. But I assigned Odyssey of a Wop, and I had one Asian American student, a young man, who wrote to me and said, "Professor, I am really grateful to you for assigning that text, but I've got halfway through and I can't go any further because I thought I'd dealt with this, but it's me and I haven't dealt with it." So that text really still resonated with someone who is first generation. But in Italy, no, John Fante is the only one who also has that cachet of being really considered, a top. And then you have to come to those people who are not, they're American. So in going back to your question, in Anglo-Americana, you may find some of the contemporary authors who, yes, have an Italian surname, but don't necessarily write as and from the position of an Italian American, and they're studied under Italo-Americana. But John Fante is a different, has a different position, and different canonization.
Another question I wanted to ask. So
yes.
I am not Italian American, but I had a time teaching English in Italy where I taught, among other things, to a retiree who would, once we were done with the lesson, would tell me stories about her family in America, and one of the ones that stuck with her as a sort of thorn in her side, which she remembered as a little girl growing up in post-war Italy, and that the family from the U.S. would send care packages, chocolate and whatever, chewing gum and things from the U.S., and she said that at first that they were so happy to get these packages, right, the poor, the countries recovering from the war, and she said then they kept sending them through the 50s and into the 60s, and just the anni del boom. And she said they would write home and say, we could buy this stuff at the supermarket, and we don't need your care packages. I know. And they would keep sending them. And I thought of it when Kim Ragusa was saying, I went to Italy and it wasn't the Italian American. I thought that the class discourse there, the way that, right, the rejection of, or the inability to process in Italy that isn't.
But it's class, but it's also generations. Again, it's going back to Ted's point, about generations, and it's true. We know. Okay, in migration studies, there's the famous, 3 generations. So the first generation arrives and integrates or doesn't integrate. It's partly to do with socialization, with education, with language, with a whole series of things. Integrates more or less, and again, gender comes into that. Classic comes into that. All. Then you have the second generation. The second generation is the one that mostly has, generational conflict and aims. A la Fante, John Fante and the Odyssey of Wop, wants to integrate and lives through that. By the third generation, unless other factors intervene, the tendencies for the heritage culture to pretty much disappear, and then what you get is the beginning of discourses of roots and rediscovering roots, and so that kind of thing. But the thing that I think is so, again, is so interesting for me about the type of narrative that Kim Ragusa is writing, again, because of her position, and because she's a very good writer, but because of her position, is that it punctures all of these things, because she cannot believe, for obvious reasons, she cannot believe the family mythology of those things. And what I do still see is that family mythology, but that family mythology ossifies and encapsulates in Italy, which was marked in so many ways, by time, by class, by location, by so many other things, and which does not exist any longer. Me and names. There's another colleague and friend who wrote a book called Pane Amaro, Bitter Trades, it's been translated as, and she came and gave a talk to my students, and she was talking about growing up in provincial Sicily, so we're not even talking Palermo, okay, in provincial Sicily in the 1960s, early 70s. Her father had emigrated to bad America, not good America, to Venezuela. She said, we called it l'America cattiva, the bad America, so you didn't get rich there. He had emigrated, he was working there, he stayed away for 8 years, 10 years, whatever it was. When he came back, and she says in the book, my mother went to get him back, because she realized that if she didn't get him back now, he was never going to come back, so she went to get him back. His 2 daughters, whom he'd left as very young children, were now teenagers, but also the Sicily he had left, which was the Sicily of the 1950s, was now the Sicily of the economic boom. And okay, it may not have been Milan, I'm thinking Müller and the Sicilian and the Milanese, sort of. It may not have been Milan, it may not have been a hippie commune, but at the same time it had changed dramatically. He came home and he couldn't recognize it, because this was not the Italy, the Sicily that he wanted. So what did he do? He took the entire family to Canada, and then from there to the post-industrial Midwest. And Giovanna, Micheli Jeffries, and Giovanna says, for me, that was antiquated, poor, derelict, So she sees that myth of modernity, that here is like, Italy is the old country and this is the modern country. She's like, I was in Sicily and I was this young teenager with all the freedom, and I ended up in this place where then in that enclave, my father could also exercise that authority in the way that he wanted to exercise it and couldn't any longer in Sicily. So for her, that was the restrictive environment, not Sicily. So all these contradictions are amazing and fantastic, are beautiful, but my students, I asked them last week, one of the groups did a presentation on Bad di Valastro Cake Boss. Anybody know Cake Boss? I didn't know Cake Boss. My students had introduced me to Cake Boss, and they were talking about one episode in which he goes back to Italy, and he makes this cake for a wedding, and then he makes another cake, and he makes a Transformers cake for a nephew or something, and then they were talking about how obviously if he had been if the family had stayed in Italy, they probably would have continued anyway to be bakers, but it would have been much more traditional. And I started asking, okay, so what's traditional? Like, for instance, do you think could you buy a Transformers cake in Italy? No, absolutely not. Why not? No, in Italy they don't have Transformers, clearly. Well, if kids like Transformers and if you wanted Transformers cake, you can go to a baker, they'll make you Transformers cake. Where's the problem? But it's like, no, Italy's tradition, so you wouldn't have a Transformers cake. That is where the stereotypical element comes in, and that's where, again, that kind of discourse needs to be punctured, deflated in some way. So, yeah, these are all attempts to do that. Whilst keeping a generation, as Ted spotted.
Thank you.